This is going to be your intermediate, lecture 5. And in this lecture, we're going to discuss parametric drafting. And that deals with doing it either with constraints or dimensions. And then we're going to also take a look at isometric dimensioning. We're going to have to create dimensioning style, and we're going to also have to use different kind of text style. And I'm sorry, we're not going to do a dimension style. We're actually going to have to use a certain type of dimension to create those. Parametric drafting. Now this is going to be kind of a precursor to most of your 3D programs. So if that's something that you're planning on doing in the future, you're going to see some of these constraints again. And basically what these are is just a way of locking things down on your drawing. So for example, anytime I draw a line in AutoCAD, that line is there, but you notice that I can move it, or I have freedom to do whatever I want. I can rotate it or do any of that kind of stuff to it. These parametric drafting, what it does, it gives you an option to lock them down. So you can either lock them down by constraints or by dimension or both. And that's what you're going to see here. Okay, so all the geometric tolerancing deals with how that line interacts with something else. So if I wanted that line not to move, for example, I can use the little lock button there and fix it. And then that just locks it down in place and says, okay, this line, well, not the whole line, the point on the line is going to not move. It could be fixed. Or I could select the whole object and lock that if I want to. And in the lecture demos, we're going to go over this and we're going to actually see how to do some of these things. And it's going to be quite easy. Then we're going to take a look at how to do some dimensional constraints. And it works just the same as as our geometric constraints, except we're just going to add a dimension to it. And then we can lock that dimension basically. So you can see all the little lock symbols on the dimensions. And that's all that it's doing. It's creating that dimension on that line or on that object, and now it's holding that dimension to that length, angle, or radius or diameter. Okay, on your dimensional constraints, you're usually going to have 3 types. So I can lock it either linear, I can lock it horizontally, I can lock it vertically, and I can also lock it aligned. And the 3 icons that you're going to see is going to be, this is the horizontal, this is a vertical, and this is an aligned one. Underneath this linear one, it'll lock also horizontal and vertical. So when you see this one on your ribbon, you'll notice that that one will do both of these two. Your other dimensional constraints has to deal with creating an angle. And then I have a radius and a diameter, and that's going to be these 3 right here. And now the form one, you don't have an icon for it. And then the last one that we're going to have is an option to take just regular dimensions that we always use, and then we can make those dimensions into dimensional constraints. Underneath the parametrics manager, what this does is it gives us a way to control things or make formulas and see all kinds of other things that we're going to use in our constraints. So as we're starting making dimensional constraints, you're going to see some of this stuff that's going to appear in that parametrics manager. So for example, here's some of the examples that you're going to see. You're going to see the name, and if you make an expression, for example, if you want to add a couple of dimensions together to produce another, so you can make them dependent on each other. So you'll get a value and you'll get a type, what type it is, and a little description of what the variable or if it's associated with anything. Okay, next let's take a look at isometric dimensioning. And when we're using isometric dimensioning, the first thing we have to realize is that, number one, we're going to have to use the aligned icon here. We're going to have to use the aligned dimension. So we can't use the horizontal, we can't use any kind of vertical, we have to use an aligned dimension. And then the command that we're going to use is going to be an obliquing. And that's what you're going to see here is that tool. When we use the angles, when we're talking about obliquing stuff, try to keep them in some kind of variance of 30 degrees. So for example, don't try to do anything at 45 degrees because an isometric is made at 30, 60, 90 degrees or some variance of that. So we're going to keep all of our angles at that 30 degrees. Okay, one other thing that we need to take a look at is angle dimensions. When we're dealing with isometrics, they are not correct. So that's just going to tell you that if I do an angle on 2 lines in an isometric view, I'm not expecting to get the correct answer. I should not be correcting. Those are going to have to be manually and overwritten. One of the last rules here is going to be that diametric and radius dimensions are not allowed when we're doing these. We're going to have to create those leaders manually. Those dimensions manually with leaders. And I think I may have skipped this rule. This is one of those really important rules, and we're going to see that in the lecture demos, is that we have to keep lines in line with each other in order to correctly get the right length. And basically what I'm meaning by that, if the points are not in that line together on 30 degrees, because we're using a dim align dimension, then that's going to throw the angle off and it's going to give us the incorrect length. The other thing that we have to do when we create these is we're going to have to create two textiles, and this is what I recommend. And so the difference between these two new textiles that we're going to have is we're going to have one with an angle of 30 and one with another angle of -30. And then from that point, we're going to use the properties, or we can use the dim edit command, dim text edit command, to rotate those, to rotate that dimension or that text even further inside of that dimension, so we can create, basically facing it on the right face. This is going to be one of our examples that we're going to look at, and the finished product will be something similar to this. So as you can see, if we have a line like this at an angle, and it's at a 45 degree, but if I measure a distance between these two, I'm probably not going to come up with a 45 degree. But we're going to go through all the steps of creating some of these dimensions and making them line up and do other things of that nature.